All right, so my guest today is Mustafa Firat. He is a graduate student in psychology at Radboud University in the Netherlands. So Mustafa, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
We're going to talk about your paper that we reviewed in class concerning immigrant status and the relationship between perceived discrimination and psychological distress. But I'll start out, as I do very broadly, with just asking, what are the research questions that most intrigue you in your work?
You mean in general?
In general, what are the research questions that guide your work?
Yeah. So in my research in the field of social psychology, I am mostly interested in, broadly speaking, intergroup relations. Particularly, I am interested in issues around intergroup contact and social identity, and how these two concepts, contact and identity, relates to intergroup outcomes such as prejudice, discrimination, and also a little bit of psychological well-being.
Okay. Thinking specifically about this paper, can you tell us a little bit of the background about why you decided to focus on this issue specifically and how you went about doing it?
I think I have two reasons or motivations to do this study. Mm-hmm. One is obviously a personal one, because when I moved to Canada to do my graduate studies, I found myself in a bicultural or multicultural environment. And since actually my time in Turkey, in my home country, I had some issues around identities, because there I am also, I think, bicultural myself. I am a Kurdish and Turkish at the same time. So when I moved to Canada, I also kind of started a sense of belonging to the Canadian society. So I had multiple identities and issues around how to negotiate them. And because our lab had data on this issue, I found it quite interesting to further explore this issue, just so to explore my identities. But I also had, of course, some research, empirical motivations to do this research. One was that the field on bicultural identity is, I think, quite new compared to the other forms of identity, because biculturalism or multiculturalism is it is something that has become more and more common in the recent decades because of the increasing population of ethnic minorities and immigration. So this literature is not at the moment quite developed and established, and I want to contribute to this field in an empirical way.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and I do agree with you that it's kind of an understudied and more common phenomenon, so it's great to see some research being done about it. In your paper, you do a nice job of laying out 5 different forms of bicultural identity, but for the sake of this discussion, I wanted to focus on 2 of them, which seem to be showing up as important in your analyses. And those were alternating bicultural identity and conflicting bicultural identity. So I've probably tried to define those in class, but because we have the expert in front of us, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you define or how you view those 2 terms, alternating bicultural identity and conflicting bicultural identity.
Yeah, sure. I will be happy to try to define these 2 concepts. But before that, I would like to clarify that I don't see myself as an expert on this topic. I have written
I'm going to stop you right there. You wrote a paper on it, so you're an expert, and I'll just ask for your definition of what these terms mean.
Yeah, sure. So I actually had, when I was working on this paper, I had a difficult time on how to define these concepts and how to define bicultural identity in general, actually, because as I said, this field is kind of in its infancy, and there are some models, theoretical models, that try to explain these concepts. And when I was reading the literature to learn more about how to define these concepts, I had a hard time, because different models have different explanations and different definitions for kind of similar or sometimes the same things. Mm-hmm. And one of those concepts is alternating identity. And there are, again, different definitions around it. For example, some researchers have a concept called compartmentalization, which refers to the case where a bicultural individual has two separate identities, let's say an ethnic and a national identity at the same time, but they suppress one of those identities or they conceal one of those identities in a given social situation because of some reason, and then they bring forward one of the other identities. So they define this as a compartmentalization, whereas there is also a concept very closely related to this, but defined in a kind of a little bit differently, which is alternating identity. Alternating identity refers to the case where a bicultural person switches between their two identities depending on the needs or norms or like whatever that social situation requires, or it is. So so there is basically a switch between two identities depending on the context.
Okay, so that was alternating. So people who feel a need that throughout the day or throughout the week, they have to shift between or downplay or upplay one of these two identities. And then what about conflicting? How do you view conflicting bicultural identity?
I think compared to alternating identity, it is kind of easier to define conflicted identity. It basically refers to the case where a bicultural person feels a conflict or inconsistency between their two identities. Let's say if you have a Canadian and Turkish identity at the same time, but you feel an inconsistency or incompatibility between these two identities because of kind of different or sometimes conflicting cultural values or norms that comes with these identities.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, they're both definitely forms of bicultural identity, but they have kind of different ways of manifesting themselves in someone. And so it was interesting just to see that, you know, some people feel different levels of either of these types of bicultural identity. It's not like you just have to be on one and then you're really low on the other. Some people feel high in many different types of bicultural identity. But we'll talk about those two, alternating and conflicting. You found that people who are high in alternating and conflicting bicultural identities have positive associations with perceived discrimination. They see more discrimination, and positive associations with psychological distress. They also report more psychological distress. And then you do the mediation analysis to show that the relationship between perceived discrimination and psychological distress in a mediation analysis can be explained by or accounted for once you control for feelings of conflicting bicultural identity and alternating bicultural identity. Hopefully I got all that right. Can I get you to just tell us a little bit about why you think that relationship emerged? Why was alternating and conflicting identities important for accounting for the relationship between perceived discrimination and psychological distress?
Yeah, so I think, so maybe first of all, I should say that what motivates us to alternate between our identities, or what causes us to feel a conflict between our identities is basically our desire to integrate into a society. And then in this integration, it is quite important how you are treated or how you perceive that you are treated by the receiving or the host society. So if you feel rejected by the receiving society, then this affects how you configure your identities, because you have identification with two or more cultures, and when you feel rejected by one of these cultural groups, then you sometimes are not sure with which group to identify, and therefore, depending on a social situation in your acculturation or integration process, you identify with one of these cultural groups and then suppress your other identity. So
Okay,
this,
so
I think,
if I can try
explains.
and reword that a little bit. Yeah, you're finding people who have a motivation to integrate into multiple cultures, but they're feeling rejected by one. I think in your example, it'd be people living in Canada, or your paper would be people living in Canada. So they have a desire to integrate across multiple cultures, but they're feeling rejected by one. And as a result of that, the rejection, they have to feel like they have to suppress some aspects of their identity. And that's leading to feelings of perceived discrimination and leading to feelings of psychological distress. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. This is what
Okay.
I tried to meant.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that you're capturing here. I wanted to get you to speculate a little bit more about some other things going on in your paper that I found interesting. One of them was that your sample comprised of both first generation, second generation, and third generation immigrants. And I'm wondering, if you think that these types of processes play out differently depending on whether you're first generation, second generation, or third generation immigrant. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think immigration generation is something quite important to consider when you are working on this topic, because as far as I remember, there are some differences between first and later generations of immigrants in terms of the level they perceive discrimination from the host or receiving society. So first generation immigrants usually tend to perceive less discrimination, whereas second or third generation immigrants tend to perceive more discrimination. This might be because second or third generation immigrants are more integrated in the society, and they kind of, because they are more involved with the system, culture, like everything, maybe they can see the nuances of implicit discrimination from the receiving host society, whereas first generation people might perceive less discrimination because they kind of migrate because of with a motivation to integrate and set up a new life, so they might perceive less discrimination. But this is, yeah, a kind of speculation. We don't really look into this in this paper, of course.
So, I mean, this is all speculation, but you think it might be the case that the overall levels of discrimination, how much discrimination you're perceiving, is dictated or is related to your first generation or second generation or third generation status. But when you do feel that sense of perceived discrimination, the processes that you found here in terms of the relationship to psychological distress work similarly when it does happen between people who are first, second, and third generation immigration. So it's more like it's less common among first generation immigrants, but when it does happen, it plays out similarly in terms of leading to psychological distress. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I kind of intuited the other opposite direction in terms of maybe more perceived discrimination for first generation immigrants, but the way that you explained it in terms of being less aware of how discrimination might play out or those implicit cues makes a lot of sense to me. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, a couple more questions for you. So your sample was entirely within Canada for obvious reasons, because that's where you were at the time. But you did, in your general discussion, bring up this idea of maybe these things look differently in other countries. So your words, not mine, is that Canada is a, quote, relatively welcoming environment for immigrants. So obviously there are weaknesses there, but in terms of, maybe it's fair to call it relatively welcoming. So do you think that what the phenomenon that you're studying would play out differently looking at immigrants in different countries?
Well, yeah, of course, like as I kind of mentioned in the paper, Canada is, compared to other countries, usually, or at least perceived as, a more welcoming society. And in fact, Canada is, I think, the first country in the world that adopted the Multiculturalism Act. So of course, this, if we test this exact same model in another country, I am sure we will get some different results, but also some similar results, I think, because here basically we test a model that is based on a theory or theoretical models that are built upon empirical findings from different contexts. So we will obviously expect at least some similarities, but I don't know what exactly, but I am also sure that there will be some differences different findings, of course. Like,
Okay.
I don't know, maybe the level of alternating or conflict might be even more relevant in countries where attitudes towards immigration and immigrants are not that much positive.
Okay. So maybe there's potential for people who are living in societies that relative to Canada are less welcoming of immigrants. They could have even stronger feelings of alternating and conflicting identities. As just an idea. Huh.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to test it and come back and tell us about it. Last question for you that I like to ask everyone is, is there an issue or an effect that you're really hoping that social psychologists over the next 5 or 10 years make a lot of progress on? Something that you think is understudied right now that you really want to see more attention paid towards?
So, like, do you mean in this field of bicultural identity discrimination?
Anything you want to talk about in social psychology,
Okay,
in intergroup relations that you think is really important and we should be devoting more attention to.
Yeah, so I want to stay within the realm of this topic, and also because I think, as I said, it's a quite new and developing area, so there are lots of things to do. So maybe one thing to do is that this bicultural identity topic has mostly, or maybe to a great extent, has been studied among immigrant groups, which is because of obvious reasons. But I think bicultural identity does not only concern immigrants, it also concerns ethnic minority people. Like, you might be, for example, in my case, I am a Kurdish in Turkey. So I also have a bicultural identity in Turkey. I am not an immigrant, I am not a migrant, but still I think I have two identities, an ethnic and a national identity. Whereas the literature mostly uses data from migrant groups, not ethnic minority groups, not ethnic minority groups that are not migrants. So I think it can be interesting to study those kind of bicultural groups as well. And also in this field, another topic that might be interesting to study is that discrimination from one's own ethnic group or one's own in-group, because studies mostly focuses on the effect of discrimination from other groups on one's bicultural identity and psychological well-being, whereas people can also perceive discrimination from their in-group. Like, for example, a Turkish people in Canada can perceive discrimination from Turkish people in Canada because of, for example, diverging from the values of Turkish culture or like things like that. So they might be rejected. So it can also be interesting to study in-group, perceived in-group discrimination rather than out-group discrimination.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I really like both of those directions. You're right, for, as you said, for obvious reasons, we tend to study bicultural identity from people who are, physically moving from one culture to another. But even people who grow up within one geographic area their entire lives can still very much feel that there are two identities that they have to navigate, whether it's at school versus home or something like that, that we should probably be studying as well. And that you will, and you'll publish more interesting papers about it. So I want to thank you for your time, Mustafa, and really appreciate it.
No, thank you for inviting me again, and thank you for your questions. Yeah, that was a nice conversation. Thanks.
Bye.